My name is Sallie Green. I was born in Pine Log Community in 1942. My parents were Jean Grace and Florence Wells Grace. My dad was a World War I veteran. He was from Texas. My parents lived in the Texas Panhandle before coming to Pine Log Community in 1939. They were living in the Texas Panhandle during the worst of the Dust Bowl days, and when they decided to come to Arkansas, it was quite a different picture for them because it rained here, and it didn't in the Texas Panhandle at that time. So my mother had been a housewife, and when we moved to Pine Log Community, continued being a housewife with, there was a brief period of time when she taught school at the old Pine Log School when it was still open. And I had a brother, Jean Grace, and a sister, Mary Lou Grace, and they were her pupils there, and we lived there until World War II broke out, when they left briefly to work, my parents did, and then returned a few years later.
What is the Pine Log Community? Where is it and what is it?
It was between White River and Indian Creek, essentially. There were families who lived on the boundaries of that area, but they were mostly scattered along White River and Indian Creek in Northeast Benton County. It was Pine Log School. I did not go there. My brother and sister did. My mother taught there, and my experience at Pine Log School was that I was a toddler and she had to take me with her to teach school because there was no place to get me babysat. So she would load me and all her school materials into a pram and push it half a mile down the road to Pine Log School and teach school there, and then push it all back home after school.
What is a pram? Describe it.
Well, a pram, a baby buggy, a little four-wheeled baby carriage.
So tell me, what was the school like? If you were, for the students that were there, what was it like?
There was no indoor plumbing, of course, no lunch facilities, or so my mother had to build a fire and draw water from the well for the drinking water and hand washing water and so forth, and then teach all day. The children all brought their lunches and just had their school day. They pretty well were turned loose at recess and lunchtime to do whatever they wanted to do until time to return to class. It was a typical one-room school with 2 student desks and a range of ages. It went from first grade through 8th, but even older children went as long as there was something they could learn by going.
Do you remember going, or you just?
I don't remember going.
Where did you go to school? You went to school?
When I came with my parents back after the war, I began school that fall at Garfield School. By that time, the Pine Log School had closed, and we rode school buses to Garfield. When I went to Garfield School, it was considerably different from what it is now. The first and second grades were combined, and we had a basement room with a wood stove. And at that time, the Garfield School went through 12th grade. So we had first through 12th grades all in one building. And my brother and sister were high school students at the time, and I was in grade school.
Back on the Pine Log School, you showed me earlier before the interview that there was some passages in a local history book that had been done that was about your grandmother, or I'm sorry,
My mother.
your mother. Can you read those?
Yes.
Kind of explain them before you do these
All right.
passages.
It's in the Garfield and Her 10 Schools book, and I think probably quite a few Garfield people have a copy of this book, but there are excerpts in it referring to the Pine Log School, because that was one of the feeder schools into the Garfield School in later years. And it on page 15 in the book, it refers to the teacher, Florence Grace, brought her preschool daughter to school. Florence said she had trouble keeping the pupils' working materials separated, for Sallie loved gathering them for her own desk. The pupils loved her and would not tell on her. They probably just put up with me because they had no choice. But that was a typical day. And then on page 62, Mrs. Marjorie Maloney Gimmicky, who sadly is deceased now, refers to the same situation, that my mother had to bring me to school with her each and every day. She says baby Sallie played on a quilt on the floor and spent some time sitting in a high chair or on her mother's lap. And one of the seat and desk units was pushed up against the wall, and with quilts and blankets, a bed was made for Sallie to nap in. So I think my mother had her hands full altogether. Pupils adjusting to going to school at Garfield probably wasn't too much of an adjustment, because they were, after all, going with the same people who had been attending Pine Log School. And Garfield School at that time was a very rural school. It was, you had the same demographics, the same students mostly had the same background. It was a farming community, and virtually no crime, no social problems whatsoever. People were not wealthy. Everyone was pretty poor, and it's not too bad if everyone's in the same boat. My parents first settled in the Pine Log area in 1939, as I said earlier. They had brought their cattle from West Texas and had some difficulties there because their cows couldn't walk on rocks and had to be beaten to make them walk around and graze, but they eventually adjusted. And but my folks were poor, and when the war came along, World War II, they moved back out to western Oklahoma and got jobs there and worked during the war to get enough money to pay off their mortgage on their property down at Pine Log, and then came back in the late mid-40s, around 47 or 8. And that was when I started school that fall. And We lived there. I went to school at Garfield through 9 grades. Then we had to be consolidated into the Rogers school system. So I went from 10th grade through 12th at Rogers. And as my senior year was ending, my parents' farm was taken by the government for Beaver Lake. And we had to move to the Bentonville area. And my parents bought a farm there, and that's where we were living when I got out of high school.
In Bentonville?
In a rural area near Bentonville. Most of our neighbors were the Maloney families. There were 3 families of Maloney's who lived near us. We had the Edwardses who lived just on the ridge above us, the Schaefers who lived on up the creek, By Golly who lived down on the river, the Bowmans. That's all who spring to mind when we first moved there. There were neighbors that I don't remember. Mr. Byron Roark lived in a cabin up the creek from us. And of course there were people in other communities, the Huffmans, that we were acquainted with, but we didn't go to school with most of them. At the Garfield School, my first grade teacher was Dorothy Ross. I later had a teacher, Mrs. Haught, I remember from 4th grade. Oh, I'm forgetting Mrs. Trueheart, who was my 2nd grade teacher, a very kind lady. Everyone remembers Mr. Wirt, the 5th and 6th grade teacher. He was quite a taskmaster. And then junior high at Garfield with Mr. Bean, Mrs. Stewart, Mrs. Bruce. They all taught there for years, and so when you went to school at Garfield, the teachers you had were probably the teachers that your brothers and sisters had. So there wasn't a great deal of turnover.
What was a typical day like?
Getting to school on the school bus, talking a little bit before the school day started. We would have our classes at lunchtime and recess. There were always softball games, basketball games in the gym, or just hanging out with our fellow pupils. When I was in the elementary grades, and junior high for that matter, there were no restrictions on the students at recess or lunchtime. We could range all over Garfield if we wanted to. We'd go to the store, or I remember a friend's aunt lived in a house near the school, and I can remember the friend and I and another girl or two going over to her house at lunchtime just to visit with her. So it was not regimented during our free time. For fun, we had Garfield basketball games, which we thought the New York Knicks couldn't compete with. We played in junior high, and during the time that the high school was at Garfield, they played schools like Rogers, but we played, when I was in junior high, we played schools like Pea Ridge, Gentry, Washburn, and Garfield always had a good basketball team. And for a scoreboard in those days, we had an old piece of chalkboard propped up on a chair on the stage in the gym, and a line drawn down through the middle of the chalkboard with us written above one side and them written above the other side, and a kid sitting there with an eraser and a piece of chalk writing in the score every time it changed. So, but we didn't care. It was good fun, and we had pie suppers and Easter egg hunts and Christmas programs and parties, and it was a good time.
What do you remember of the businesses that were open in those days?
They were mostly small stores. Sadie Wirt's store right across the street from the school. She was the wife of Mr. Wirt, who taught 5th and 6th grades. There was Benbow's store, which was a few blocks down the highway on the same side as the school. And there was Mrs. Ford's store across the highway and down a bit. At one time, there had been Harry Baker's store. But when I was in 1st grade, that burned down. And I only remember walking across the highway and walking up and looking in the big crater, which had been the store the day before. And but that left us with Wirt's, Benbow's, and Ford's stores. As far as other businesses were concerned, Mr. Benbow, I believe, worked on cars, and so did Austin Klein, who lived across the highway from the school. Not a lot of businesses, I'm afraid. When I left this community, of course, I was a senior in high school when we had to move over by Bentonville. And at that time, most young people had to leave the area to find work. And my brother was living in Ohio at the time. He had just finished college, and I stayed with him for a while and worked, and then moved back soon after and began college at the University of Arkansas. And after a couple of years, about 3 years, I married my husband, and we lived in Rogers briefly, then Springdale, and then with his work, we moved around the country and in other places quite a lot. My husband and I try to stay in touch with the local Garfield people as much as possible. He still has a sister who lives here. We are on the Garfield Reunion Committee, which tries to meet every year and have all us oldsters get together. We still meet Garfield people for lunch now and again, and visit with them every chance we get. The people from down on White River and Indian Creek and around Garfield are very precious to us, and that's a connection we'd never want to lose. A great many people were displaced during the time of the military part going in and the lake going in, which happened within 2 years of each other. And it was quite a wrenching experience for everyone who lived in those places. And but I'll never forget what a wonderful place it was, and a wonderful time it was to grow up where I did. It was, we were poor. It was very hard on our parents making ends meet. They worked so hard for very little, but it was, I could not have asked for a finer place to be born and grow up. The Benton County I knew and grew up in no longer exists. Benton County was a good place to live. It had a variety of people. Those who would say it was all monochromatic, no differences, with no different cultures or anything, just didn't live here. There were a lot of different people with different ways of making a living. It was a very diverse area. There were well-to-do farmers, lots of farmers who were not so well-to-do, business people, the city of Rogers. On Saturday afternoon, there would be throngs of people there doing their weekly shopping, selling things that they'd grown on their farms, and it was a delightful place. Benton County now is an urban area. There are not very many farms left. It's all been, they're all suburbs now. So it has changed drastically.
How would you finish this sentence? My favorite thing about Benton County is
That there are still some pockets of the old Benton County. You have to look really hard to find them. But those small pockets and the people who are left are a treasure.